Vasco da Gama. Vasco da Gama was having trouble with his men. 4 months had passed since they'd left their home in Portugal in search of a water route to India. They'd traveled thousands of miles through terrible storms before they'd rounded the southern tip of Africa at the Cape of Good Hope, a Cape Bartholomew Diaz had discovered 9 years before. But there, Diaz had stopped and turned back. What lay before da Gama and his sailors were unknown waters, strange lands and people, and maybe, or maybe not, a sea route to India. It was the fervent hope of their king and their countrymen that India did lay ahead, and that da Gama would find it. For India possessed riches in spices, jewels, and silk that could make Portugal the wealthiest nation in the world. Until now, the only route to India had been overland, a long, treacherous journey through country controlled by the Muslims, or as Europeans called them, Moors. The Arabs now had a complete monopoly on trade with the East. Europe desperately needed a sea route to India if it was to develop its own trade. 6 years before da Gama, Christopher Columbus had left Spain to find such a route by traveling west. He had failed. Now da Gama would try an eastern approach. It was now November in 1497, and yet another storm was battering at da Gama's ships. The captain stood on deck, peering into the dark and the slashing rain, wondering what lay ahead, and wondering what to do about his men. The men were tired and frightened. They'd been at sea a long time, and had suffered terrible hardship. But nothing they had suffered concerned them as much as what they might suffer in the future. What waited for them in the unknown seas? What if India couldn't be reached this way? What if they sailed on forever and ever into eternity? What if they never saw land again? What if their food and water ran out? What if there were enemies out there? What if the seas were full of whirlpools or monsters or giant rocks? Da Gama was growing angry now. He was sure that somewhere beyond them to the east was India, and he was disgusted by his men's lack of courage. He had heard they were talking of turning back. Well, Vasco da Gama was not turning back. He had never turned back from danger before, and he wasn't going to do it now. He had promised his king he would find India, and find it he would. At that moment, one of the 4 ships of da Gama's fleet sailed close to his own, and he heard the captain shout, "If we don't turn back, the men will kill us and sail the ships home themselves. We must turn back." At first, da Gama was shocked that even his bravest captain had turned into a coward. Then it occurred to him the captain was trying to warn him. The men must be planning a mutiny. It was then that da Gama came up with a plan. He called his grumbling, fearful crew together and pretended to agree to their plan. "We shall turn back," he told them, "but first you must all sign a paper telling the king that you forced me to do it." The men were only too happy to agree. Better to face the wrath of the king and disgrace at home than a horrible, slow death in unknown seas. Da Gama then ordered the sailors who were leading the rebellion to go into his cabin to sign the papers releasing him of guilt. But as the men gathered below, suddenly the door to da Gama's cabin flew open, and there before them were a group of loyal sailors armed with pistols. They grabbed the mutineers and put them in chains. Then da Gama went on deck and gathered up all the compasses and instruments that had been used to navigate the ships through the Atlantic Ocean. He stood before his crew and held the instruments high above his head. Then, to their horror, he tossed them into the sea. "Now," said da Gama, "we sail with God as our pilot." The men had no choice but to resign themselves to their fate. There would be no turning back into the Atlantic now. The only course was eastward, onward with their bold captain towards the mysterious waters between Africa and India. The daring and determination of Vasco da Gama wouldn't have surprised his king back home in Portugal. The king was once heard to remark that da Gama was a person who knew how to get things done. Da Gama was famous as a man who knew almost everything there was to know about the sea and ships. After all, he'd been born in a seaport in the country that led the world in seafaring and exploration, and his father, too, had been known for his strong leadership qualities. Da Gama was born sometime between the years 1460 and 1469, right before the peak of Europe's great age of exploration. For the next 30 years, navigators from Western Europe would search all along the Atlantic shores of Africa for a sea route to India, and a few, like Columbus and Magellan, would even venture westward across the Atlantic, not expecting to find the continents of the Americas to be in their way. Da Gama was in his 20s when all of Portugal rejoiced at the return of Bartholomew Dias from the Cape of Good Hope at Africa's southern tip. Dias had braved terrifying currents and turbulent weather to make his discovery, and now that discovery had given Portugal new hope. If Dias could get that close to the Indian Ocean, which lay on the other side of Africa, then perhaps some other brave man could lead his ships across the ocean. On the other side were the great trading centers on the eastern coast of India, like Calicut. But the Indian Ocean was vast. That much everyone knew. What they didn't know was how long it would take to cross it, or what the currents were like, or the weather, or what other unexpected dangers may be lurking there. To find out, Portugal would need a man of great skill and courage. Da Gama was born in a seaport in the south of Portugal called Sines, but little else is known about the first 30 years of his life. He was the youngest of 3 sons of a nobleman named Esteban da Gama, who served for a time as mayor of Sines and commanded the city's fortress. Da Gama probably attended a nearby school, as most boys of his class did. As a young man, he learned astronomy and navigation, 2 almost required subjects in this country that ruled the seas of Europe. Somewhere in the mid-1480s, Vasco da Gama became a member of the royal court and was one of the most trusted assistants of King John II, a king who must have had fairly sound judgment, since the nickname his subjects gave him was John the Perfect. Da Gama distinguished himself early on by helping to seize French ships that had invaded the Portuguese ports in 1492. He was made an officer and commanded ships all along the coast of Portugal. John the Perfect was in the process of organizing an expedition to cross the Indian Ocean when he died suddenly in 1495, the year Christopher Columbus had crossed the Atlantic in his second voyage for Spain. Columbus, too, had once sailed for Portugal, but he'd changed his loyalties when Portugal refused to finance his voyage westward. Although Columbus hadn't yet found a route to India by heading west, there was always the possibility he might, and Portugal was feeling more anxious than ever to try and beat him by finding a route eastward. After John the Perfect died, King Manuel I ascended to the throne of Portugal. It took him 2 years to follow up on John's plan for a voyage around Africa, but when he finally made his decision, he did it with great pomp and circumstance. At a ceremony at his summer castle near Lisbon, he gathered together all the elegant priests, nobles, and state officials, and grandly announced he was sending out a fleet to find a sea passage to India. That sea route would hopefully accomplish 2 things. It would enable Portugal to acquire the rich merchandise of the East through trade, and it would enable Portugal to spread the word of Christianity to new lands. King Manuel then further announced that the voyage would not be an easy one. The sailors would be crossing waters no European had ever before crossed. Many of the ports along the way would be ports belonging to the Moors, longtime enemies of the Christians. But King Manuel had chosen a man to lead the Portuguese expedition whom he felt the people could put their greatest faith in. If anyone could make a successful voyage across the Indian Ocean, it was their naval hero, Captain Major Vasco da Gama. The truth is that the king had originally chosen da Gama's father to lead the expedition, but the elder da Gama died even before plans could get underway. It is also said that the king's second choice was then Vasco's older brother, Paulo, who declined because of ill health. But the king wasn't unhappy when he finally settled on the younger da Gama. He had equally as good a reputation as the other members of his family. Da Gama left the port of Lisbon shortly after King Manuel's grand speech on July 8, 1497, when he was about 37 years old. There were 4 ships in his fleet, 3 regular sailing ships, and a storage ship loaded with supplies. Da Gama sailed on a ship named the São Gabriel. The other 2 ships were the São Rafael and the Barrio. Both the São Gabriel and the São Rafael were medium-sized ships that weighed about 120 tons and were powered by 3 masts. The Barrio was a smaller 50-ton ship. The only navigational equipment the ships carried were compasses, an instrument called an astrolabe for measuring the stars, and astronomical maps. All of these would later be jettisoned when the crew threatened to turn back towards home. On board were also several stone pillars, which would be erected wherever the crew landed. These pillars would announce to the world that Christians had been there, and that Portugal might someday add these lands to the territories it had already claimed in Africa. Among the crew members, there were 3 interpreters, 2 who spoke Arabic, and 1 who spoke several African dialects. As the crowds cheered and wished them luck, Da Gama and his 170 men set sail on what was to be the longest ocean voyage ever made. Accompanying the ships as they set out that summer morning was another ship commanded by Bartholomew Diaz himself. The man who had discovered the Cape of Good Hope was now on his way back to Africa, where he intended to do some trading on the Gold Coast in what is now Ghana. Da Gama's fleet made 2 short stops, one on the African mainland and another at the Cape Verde Islands, off the far western tip of Africa. The waters off the coast of Central Africa are known for their turbulence, so Da Gama then made the strategic decision to sail westward away from Africa and almost all the way to South America to avoid the dangerous currents. Then he headed south and back across the Atlantic to southern Africa. 96 days after they left Lisbon, the fleet landed 200 miles north of the Cape of Good Hope at the Bay of St. Helens. The men ran onto shore, happy to feel earth under their feet once again. Before long, they discovered there were others in this land, people with brown skin who lived beyond the sandy hills that ridged the bay. They were called Hottentots. The Hottentots were hesitant to come out at first. The Portuguese made a fearful sight in their armor and metal helmets, marching about in tall leather boots with swords dangling at their sides. But after a few days of observing the sailors as they gathered wood and other supplies, the Hottentots ventured closer and happily accepted the trinkets Da Gama offered them. One sailor, a man named Ferneo Veloso, decided he wanted to return over the hills with the natives and get a look at their village. Da Gama didn't like the idea. They still knew very little about the natives, and he had no desire to lose one of his best soldiers in the African wilderness. Da Gama finally relented when his brother Paulo, who had come along as captain of one of the ships, encouraged him to let Veloso explore. Only a few hours later, Veloso was back, scurrying down the hills with several natives chasing him, all armed with wooden spears. Veloso was wounded in the leg, but Da Gama's men were able to row him out to his ship before further damage was done. When teased about how he'd come down the hill much faster than he went up it, Veloso cheerfully replied, "Well, of course, I suddenly realized you fellows could never get along if anything happened to me." That was the end of the short friendship between the Portuguese and the Hottentots of St. Helens Bay. The next morning they set sail again, and 6 days later they rounded the Cape of Good Hope and landed in what is now South Africa. They spent 2 weeks gathering supplies and transferring the goods from their storage boat onto the other 3 ships so the storage boat could be left behind. Another group of Hottentots appeared from the hills, but this time the relationship was friendly from beginning to end. When the sailors embarked again, the Hottentots stood on shore playing farewell songs with their flutes, which the Portuguese answered with their trumpets. Then all broke into a dance, the Hottentots on land and the sailors on shipboard. In the middle of December, Da Gama's crew arrived at the farthest point reached by Bartholomew Diaz 9 years earlier. From here on in, they were in uncharted waters. It was at this point, out at sea again after so many months of travel, and headed into the unknown, that Da Gama had to quell the rebellion of the sailors who wished to turn back. With everything back under control, he worked his way eastward until he rounded the tip of Africa, and then the fleet headed north along its eastern shores, stopping now and then to explore unknown lands and to leave one of their stone pillars. Whenever they landed, they were met by more Hottentots or by tribes of Zulus, all of whom offered them food, water, animal skins, and ivory in exchange for trinkets the sailors had brought from home. Finally, in March 1498, the Portuguese came across a different type of civilization, one where the people lived in attractive white houses and were fully clothed like Europeans. They had finally stumbled upon the great trading centers of their enemies, the Moors. The first Muslim colony the sailors encountered was in Mozambique, but in a strange twist of fate, neither people recognized the other as their enemies. The Sultan of Mozambique presumed the sailors were followers of Muhammad, and the sailors presumed these civilized-looking tradesmen must be Christians. For a while, all was well. But then Da Gama asked the Sultan if he could supply some men to guide his fleet through the Arabian Sea, the northern section of the Indian Ocean. Once these men were on board, they soon realized that the sailors were Christians and they deserted. When Da Gama heard the Sultan was now planning an attack on his fleet, he quickly sailed onward. Perhaps he thought he could find guides at another port along the way. The next stop was Mombasa, but there was no friendly welcome waiting for the sailors there either. Instead, the Moors launched plans to seize the Portuguese ships, and Da Gama was forced to level their waterfront with his ship's cannons. Weary, the sailors traveled on to the next port, Melindi, the largest Arab port in East Africa, located in what is now Kenya. Here the Sultan had already heard about the large cannons the Portuguese were carrying, and so he readily supplied them with food, and, more valuable yet, an elderly man named Ibn Majid, who was the finest navigator of the Arabian Sea. It was the Arab Ibn Majid who successfully guided Da Gama and his fleet across the waters of the Indian Ocean and up the coast of India to the great city of Calicut. When they first spotted the shadowy lands of India, the crew knelt down on the deck and thanked God for bringing them safely to their goal. 314 days had passed since the ships had left Lisbon, but they had fulfilled their promise. They had opened a sea passage for Portugal and all of Europe to the rich lands of the East. Now they had only to collect their bounty and return home the way they had come. For 1 day and 1 night, the ships cruised the coast of India, scanning the wide, sandy beaches of its shores. Then, on May 20th, 1498, they arrived at Calicut. In its harbors, there were many ships with brightly colored sails. Sailors were loading and unloading cargoes filled with the spices, silks, and jewels that had made India famous throughout Europe. Da Gama and his men were eager to have their share. They disembarked, erected one of their stone pillars to prove they had reached India, and marched hopefully into town to make arrangements for trade. What Da Gama had not been counting on was the Hindu king of Calicut, a conflicted, ambivalent ruler named Zamorin, who wasn't quite sure what to do about Da Gama. At first, the Portuguese made the same mistake they'd made with the Arabs on the African coast. They mistook the Hindus for Christians, but soon they recognized that Zamorin and his people followed yet another faith, so any hope of approaching them as brothers was abandoned. Da Gama got off to a bad start when he presented Zamorin with gifts brought from Portugal, which the Hindu leader considered worthless. The gifts were suitable for Africa, but the Portuguese, knowing little of India, had underestimated how culturally refined it was. Da Gama then presented Zamorin with his proposal that they conclude a trade agreement between their two countries. Zamorin liked the idea of establishing trade with Portugal, a country that Da Gama assured him was the most powerful country on earth. Da Gama had promised that, in exchange for India's riches, Portugal would send ships loaded with far better goods than his ships had come with, things like gold, silver, and elegant cloth. This sounded much better to Zamorin, but unfortunately he had politics to deal with. Arab merchants in Calicut had no desire to share their wealth with a Christian king. For many years they had been sending spices and jewels to Europe over the slow, dangerous land route. It was obvious to them that Da Gama had discovered a far better route, a sea passage that might put them out of business. So they pressured Zamorin to arrest him. He was a pirate, they said, with a secret plan for sacking the city. His letter from his king was a sham. Anyone could have written and signed it. Zamorin had no idea whom to believe. On 2 different occasions he invited Da Gama and his crew to the palace, where he held a gala celebration for them. Then, on a 3rd occasion, he threw Da Gama and 13 of his men into prison at the insistence of the Arabs. He released them only after Da Gama's brother, Paulo, and the other captains still on the ships threatened to put their cannons to use. In the end, Da Gama managed to convince Zamorin of his sincerity. He sailed from Calicut on August 29th, his ship's holds bulging with cinnamon, cloves, ginger, nutmeg, pepper, and precious jewels. On board were half a dozen Hindus, one of whom Zamorin had sent as his official ambassador to Portugal. The others were invited so that King Manuel could learn about their customs and beliefs. The trip back to Lisbon was long and difficult. This time the fleet was sailing against the wind. It had taken them 23 days to cross the Arabian Sea to India, but it took them 3 months to cross it back to Africa. As the ships headed into the southern parts of the Indian Ocean, a dreadful case of scurvy hit the crew. So many men were lost that Da Gama had to burn one of his own ships, the São Rafael, for lack of a crew to handle it. Now only 2 of the original 4 vessels remained, and of the 170 men who had left Portugal, there were now only 55. After the 2 ships rounded the tip of Africa and headed into the Atlantic, they were battered by storms and became separated at sea. They never found each other and returned to Lisbon separately, almost 2 months apart. Da Gama made a side trip to the Azores, where he spent some time recovering from the death of his brother Paulo, who died on the islands of consumption. The first ship, the Berrio, staggered into the port of Lisbon at the beginning of July in 1499. Da Gama's ship, the São Gabriel, arrived September 9th after a journey of 2 years and nearly 24,000 miles. The entire city came out to meet Da Gama, and the celebrations continued for days. King Manuel was pleased with the riches they'd brought back. He was delighted with his Hindu ambassador from India, and all of Portugal was proud and excited that they had found the very first sea route to the lands of the East. Da Gama was well rewarded. He was given money, an annual pension, the title of Dom, which is equivalent to the English Sir, and a parcel of land. Only a year later he married a noblewoman named Catherine de Atade, and together they had 6 children, all of them boys. Da Gama, however, was not the type to settle into a comfortable domestic life in the suburbs of Lisbon. 3 years after his return to Portugal, he set out for India once again, but this time it was a mission of war. After Da Gama had returned to Portugal, the king had sent another fleet to India under the command of Pedro Alvarez Cabral. Cabral left some of his men behind in India, and word soon reached Portugal that the men had been massacred. The murders had been committed by Hindus who had been incited by Muslim traders. King Manuel wanted revenge. In 1502, the king sent Da Gama to take possession of Calicut and all other trading centers along the eastern coast of Africa and India to break Muslim control of the area. With the title of Admiral of India and 20 ships, 10 of them warships, he set out to claim for Portugal the lands he discovered in 1499. After a series of brutal naval bombardments of ports on both sides of the Indian Ocean, and the massacre of many innocent Indians and Muslims, he accomplished his mission. His most savage assault was at a port in southwestern India called Cananore. He lay in wait at the port for the arrival of Arab ships. After several days, one ship approached bearing merchandise and as many as 400 passengers, many of them women and children. Da Gama seized the cargo, locked up all the passengers in the hold, and set the ship on fire, killing everyone on board. Then he moved on to Calicut and his old friend Zamorin. Zamorin approached in peace, but Da Gama demanded that he banish all Muslim traders from the port. To prove he meant business, he massacred 38 Indian fishermen who had sailed out to his ships to sell their wares to the sailors. He had them thrown overboard so their bodies would wash ashore and be seen by all. After a few more battles and several forced alliances, Da Gama returned to Lisbon for a second hero's welcome. Now much of India was under Portuguese rule, and would remain so until the Dutch arrived and seized control 160 years later. Again, Da Gama was showered with gifts, money, and honors, including a large grant of land that made him a count and one of the wealthiest men in Portugal. As part of his privileges, he was entitled to collect taxes and rents in 2 Portuguese towns. Apparently, Da Gama was dissatisfied with his rewards and felt he deserved even more. In particular, he wanted the leadership of his hometown, Sines. After a few years of debate, he was awarded Sines as well, and once again he was on friendly terms with his government. Da Gama became an important advisor to the king on India, and divided his days between duties at the royal court and time spent with his family on his private estate. Still, Da Gama's days of travel were not over yet. After Da Gama's second trip to India, King Manuel died and was succeeded by John III. The new monarch sent Da Gama back to India in 1524 as viceroy, or governor, of all the territories he'd won for Portugal on his second trip. His assignment was to establish some sort of administrative order in India, a task that was almost as difficult as his famous crossing of the Indian Ocean. Da Gama was organizing his administration in the city of Cochin in India when he died on Christmas morning, 1524, at about the age of 64, from an unknown illness. He was buried at a Christian monastery in Cochin, but 11 years later his body was exhumed and sent back to Portugal, where it was interred in a church on the estate he'd been given by his king. Vasco da Gama, like almost all explorers and conquerors of the 15th and 16th centuries, was a man who made a dramatic impact on history, but whose behavior and actions are difficult to accept when viewed from a modern perspective. In the context of his own times, he behaved no better or worse than others of his class and culture. He was a man of enormous courage and skill, and a man of deep prejudice, capable of merciless brutality. He was a man devoted to God and his church, loyal to his king and country, and with no regard or tolerance of other religions, races, or cultures. He was, in short, a typical 15th century European. What was not typical was what he accomplished. He was the very first European to travel by sea to India. He was therefore the first to open an all-water trade route between Europe and Asia. This route was the only direct connection between East and West, since Marco Polo had traveled overland 200 years before. Because of da Gama, the rich lands of the East were open to direct trade with Europe, and also because of da Gama, the lands of the East became open to colonization. He laid the foundation for the vast Portuguese Empire that included colonies in Africa, India, and the Spice Islands. He made Portugal a world power and ushered in a new era in world history. Most importantly, Vasco da Gama, in spite of the appalling methods he used, was instrumental in formulating a cultural link between East and West, which before his time existed as almost two completely different worlds. If there is a moment at which East met West and West met East, it was the moment in 1499 when Vasco da Gama sailed out of the Indian Ocean and on to the shores of India.
This is the end of the session.